As acceptance of marriage equality and same-sex marriage swept across the country, we at RFL kept asking, can you ever recall another issue where people's minds and opinions have changed so much so fast? Well, it turns out there's another issue. We got poll numbers to prove it, and this one may be catching you off guard. Legalization of marijuana, not for medical purposes, mind you, just for recreationally getting high. A Gallup poll last month, support for legalization at a record high at more than 58%. And that's a 10-point spike just in 1 year. Now, the speed of the change, it's amazing. From 36 support just 5 years ago, 25% in the late 90s, and just 12% if you want to go back to 1969. That, again, at the height of peace, love, and happiness and whatever. Now, look at the dramatic change in those lines. You follow the poll numbers, and it really just tells you just how fast this issue has gone. Now, as opinions change, so are laws. 2 states, Colorado and Washington, as many of you know, now have legalized recreational use. In other states, like California, they got medical marijuana laws so lax, the stigma and the legal penalties when it comes to recreational use are nearly zero. Even in our region, pot's been decriminalized in New York and Connecticut, where low-level possession's punishable with the most equivalent of a ticket. Now, Tuesday, marijuana reformers, they got even more good news from voters. From a tax on recreational sales in Colorado, finally making good on the argument to tax and regulate weed, to legalization and decriminalization votes in a whole slew of cities. No pro-pot ballot measure was defeated anywhere at the polls. And for more on the sea change when it comes to marijuana laws and how it's viewed, let's bring in Gabriel Sayegh. He is the New York State Director of the Drug Policy Alliance, a group dedicated to the legalization of marijuana and the end of drug laws. We spoke a few hours ago. And for more on this, we're bringing in our guest now. Gabriel Sayegh is the State Director for the New York Drug Policy Alliance. And you know, Gabriel, before we I got a host of questions for you, but I looked at a Gallup poll in terms of American public opinion on the issue of legalizing marijuana. And the only thing I guess I can compare it to is gay marriage when it comes to the velocity of public opinion on how much opinions have changed on this. You don't have to go back. They started doing this in '69. Just go to 2001. More than 2-to-1 Americans, 64 to 31%, were opposed to it. Now in the most recent poll, 58% approve it, while only 39% are in opposition. It's amazing how fast opinions have changed on this issue.
Yeah, it's a trend that is surprising to many. And the Gallup poll, as you noted, landed at 58% in support. Other polls have found similar support for ending marijuana prohibition. I think what's very clear here is that Americans are tired of these failed drug war policies, and they're ready for a new approach. And that's why I think we saw voters in Washington and Colorado vote to end marijuana prohibition in those states, tax it, regulate it, bring it under the rule of law. And then just this Tuesday, voters in Portland, Maine, voted to legalize marijuana for recreational use for adults. This is a trend, I think, that is increasing, and we're going to see more debate happen around our current drug policies and marijuana policies specifically.
Is this generational still at this point, Gabriel, where if we broke it down and asked people over 50 versus people under 25 their opinions, there's a huge divide, or is it narrowing?
That divide is narrowing, but there is still a divide there. I mean, the older Americans are less likely to support legalization of marijuana, whereas younger Americans are more likely to support. But what we're seeing is that as the baby boomers mature, and they look at these policies, that they're increasingly willing to say, we've got to do something different here. This tired old approach, the status quo, has failed us. It's cost hundreds of billions of dollars. It's criminalized an entire generation of young people, mostly young people of color, and we're not gaining any of the tax benefits here. We need to do something different. And I think that's what these polls are indicating.
But do you think what's driving is more resignation for people that if you can't beat them, join them, or that younger people say this isn't the demon weed anymore, the stigma attached to marijuana, whether it be through pop culture or whatever else, isn't what it was a generation ago?
I think it's a mix of things. I mean, for one, marijuana is the most commonly used illicit substance in the United States. 100 million Americans have tried it. And you have an increasing number of Americans who are using marijuana for medical purposes in the 20 states that have medical marijuana laws. Most recently, New Hampshire and Illinois passed such laws. We're considering one here in the state of New York. I think what we've got is a scenario where even people who are not marijuana consumers are coming to the conclusion that our current policies are broken and we need a new direction. Those votes that happened in Colorado and Washington in 2012 that legalized marijuana in those states, those were by no means pro-pot votes. Those were votes by voters in those two states where they were saying, we're tired of these policies.
You know what's I find amazing is some of the advocates to legalize it who may have been opponents in the past say, hey, let's legalize marijuana because it'll help us pay to build schools. And when you combine the two, building schools to legalize pot, they seem oxymorons. But that, I guess, is part of what the sell is, that you can not only tax the stuff, it'll be revenue generators, and look at where we're going to put the money. It's almost to a degree, maybe not a fair comparison, but you use lotto money to pay for state education, a thin tax, but if you put an application to it, it might be more palatable to the electorate.
Yeah, I think that comparison you're making is actually entirely fair. I mean, think about what the cigarette taxes that we have here in New York, the highest in the nation, right here in New York City. I mean, those taxes help fund a range of social service programs and other important health programs. It's similar with alcohol taxes or with the sin taxes, as they're called, for gambling or lotto and so forth. The question is, what do we want to happen with the tens of millions or billions of dollars that are being generated right now in the marijuana market?
Finally, I'll give you the devil's advocate question, and I guess there's two pieces to it. One is, you legalize this, the message you're sending, especially to youth, is the gateway drug. If you call that a marijuana here, it's okay, with the unintended consequences that may follow. And secondly, is this opening Pandora's box, where if you legalize marijuana, why not go down the line and legalize cocaine or other harder drugs? How do you answer those two issues?
Well, with the first, just from a scientific basis, there is actually no evidence whatsoever to suggest that marijuana is a gateway drug. It's a good soundbite for people, but there's actually no factual basis. It's simply not true. With respect to the Pandora's box question, it's interesting because when you look at the other drugs, cocaine, heroin, and so forth, there is a legitimate debate to be had about whether or not what we're doing currently is effective. And I think many astute observers would conclude that it's simply not. That doesn't mean that we would necessarily move towards legalization.
Gabriel Sayegh, I appreciate a few minutes. Real quick, 5 years from now, we're having this conversation. Marijuana legal in New York, yes or no?
Well, hopefully medical marijuana at the very least. People who have cancer and multiple sclerosis should not have to suffer while people in New Jersey and Connecticut are able to gain access to their medicine. So at least in that 5-year period, we should have that here for New Yorkers.
Thanks again, Gabriel. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
And just a reminder, you can find the whole unedited interview with Gabriel Sayegh, as well as our entire RFL interview collection here. If you go to YouTube, our YouTube page, just search YouTube for Richard French for a listing. All right, marijuana laws and the pot prohibition, both the politics and the policy of it, when we come back right after this break here. Should marijuana be legal for recreational use? We'll talk about the table. We're asking you at home. Make your answers heard as well. Stay with us. We'll be right back.